If you're toiling away in your garage, building a custom motorcycle on your own, but you're stuck and need help, then head over to my website and sign up for my free technical newsletter series. We're talking about paint, mechanical, electrical, metalworking and restoration techniques, all the things that you need to build a motorcycle at home. Head over there, sign up today and get started. G'day everyone, Matt from Crank Engineering, and in the shop today I've got this SR400 and the client is looking for a cafe racer style hoop to be fitted to the rear. So there's a bit of cutting and welding to be done and a custom seat pan which I've got to get done today so we can get it upholstered. So I'm going to step through in some detail the actual process that I'm following to do this job. I'm not just going to show you cutting it off and welding, that's pretty boring, but I'll talk about how and why I do it the way I do it. I'm not saying my way is the best way or the only way, it's just the way I do it. So you might be able to pick something up from this video for an SR400 of your own, or any similar Japanese or British bike. You can use this type of approach on. So let's get started. Okay, so all this structure you can see now is all stock Yamaha frame. This bike is I think a mid-90s build. So it's had some modifications done already. There's a tray in here with a very small little lithium-ion battery, which will obviously maintain that. But where our job is going to be pretty much from here back. So this is all standard mount fenders, mounting the seat, so this is all going to go. So this part of the frame, this triangle here, is generally one of the structural components, and obviously the suspension comes off the swing arm and mounts at this point here, so there's another triangle here. So the triangles are all the structural parts. So I don't consider anything behind this mount to be particularly structural. I know a pillion sits on here, but this is just a cantilever off the frame, so you're not going to kill anybody necessarily by cutting off a small part of this frame well behind this connection here. So this is definitely the important part, and we'll spend a bit of time looking at it and working out where we're going to cut this off to weld on the hoop. Okay, so for whatever reason, this frame's made up of a bunch of round tubes. So there's a pair of tubes coming from the front towards the back, and they look like they're about 20 millimeters in diameter, 19, 3/4, 20, something like that. And there's a larger one here, which looks like 22 or 7/8, probably 22 being a metric bike. And these tubes obviously head in this direction, and then Yamaha have taken this steel bracket, which is probably stamped. So two parts, there's two halves here, there's a split down the center here. You can see they're made up of two parts. So they're sandwiched these on the frame, and then they've welded around here, welded it around there, and this is forming the structural part of the suspension connection to the frame. So this is definitely structural around here, and then at the back here is just, these are the seat mounts, and then there's fender mounts and some other stuff as well. So here is sort of cosmetic stuff, and here it's the structural stuff. So there's a weld all the way around here that goes around on the back side in a similar fashion, and you might be able to see it if I zoom in on here. So I'll go out a bit. So there's a weld on the back side here, around the back, and then down, and on the front you can see it around here. Now the other telltale sign I can see here, there's a plug weld right here, and I'll just see if I can zoom in. Oop, other way, zoom in on that. Yeah, that comes up on the camera. There's a plug weld here. So that tells me that there's something behind this plate that they wanted to weld to probably to locate and strengthen this whole structure. So that's telling me there's a tube, most likely this one, continues through here. Let me go back out a bit. Most likely this tube here continues right through and then is welded here. So I'm expecting if I cut through here, then there'll be a steel tube there. Now, at some point we have to find those tubes because we need to find the ends of them so that we can weld this hoop on. So the client supplied this hoop purchased specifically for this bike, so I might have to do a bit of tweaking to get it to fit, but hopefully it's pretty close. So at the very least the spacing should be about the same as the frame rails, and the tube diameter should be the same as what they've used on the frame as well. So looks pretty close, maybe. Anyway, we'll figure that out when we get to it. One way or the other, we've got to make it fit. Okay, so in terms of cutting, we could just chop it off well behind the suspension mount, and if there's tube here, then we could use this area here as the connection point for the hoop to go around the back here. So the customer's told me he wants it 58 centimeters from the tank to the back of the hoop, so we'll have to cut both the frame and the pre-supplied hoop to the right length to get that finished dimension where he wants it. But I'm going to take my first cut probably just to the rear of this plug weld, just to catch the edge of the plug weld. And the idea is I'm trying to locate what's in behind here. Now, obviously I can always cut more off, but putting something back on is way more difficult. So I'll always cut long and then work my way back to the position where I really want the finished, part of the frame to be. So I'm steering well clear of this suspension mount, and ideally, we'd blend this bracket back into the frame, but I don't think that's going to happen. We're going to have to cut it, and then the hoop will just hang off the back behind it. So the client did tell me he has seen people who just grind this off or grind this flat and put the seat pan on it. My preference would be to take this part of the bracket off. It's welded here, and then it's welded here. So if we ground that weld off and continued it to the plug weld, then I'm hoping we can take this top part of this bracket off, because it's ugly and it's really not going to suit the style of the bike. So it'll be a cosmetic modification to make it look appropriate. So let's mark this up and put a cut through here, and let's see what we can see behind or around this plug weld. Okay, so I'm going to cut it right behind the plug weld here. Now, I much prefer to do this when the bike's completely disassembled, because you'll get carbon and steel dust from this operation everywhere. Makes a hell of a mess, especially if the bike's still assembled, and if there's any oil leaks, then this stuff sticks to the oil, makes a hell of a mess. So, prefer to do this when the bike's stripped, and I would recommend the same. 5-inch angle grinder, brand new disc. And the reason I like a 5-inch angle grinder for this job is I can generally get right through the frame with one cut. So if I had a 4-inch grinder, I'd have to do one from the front and one from the back. So not necessary with a larger grinder. And I use these quite narrow, 1mm wide cutting discs, which work really well for this application. So these are a Bosch brand, but you can use whatever you can find in your local area. So let's get chopping. Okay, so we were right. Well, I was right. That's the end we've just chopped off, and you can just see, hopefully in the camera, there's only about 3 or 4 millimeters of tube left. So we guessed good. So if we have a look in detail at the frame itself, you can see pretty clearly there's the 2 sandwich pieces of frame or plate around the frame, and then there's the tube, which is just an extension of the frame tube from the front of the bike. So alright, that's done exactly what we wanted. I've basically cut it right at the end of the existing frame, so it's given me as much frame to work with as possible. So that'll be where we most likely do our connection. So I'm going to cut the other one in the same location on the other side, and then we'll work out what we're going to do in terms of cleaning up this frame. Okay, so that came out pretty well. That's really given us a lot to work with in terms of where we can keep going from here. So I'm going to cut this off because it's ugly as sin. So I'm just going to I can see here that this tube's welded pretty much in the center line, and what I'm going to have to do is, if I cut all of this off and put a slice through here, I'm going to have to weld this plate back onto this tube. So I'm going to cut it in a location that gives me a chance to do that. So I'm aiming just above the plug weld and in line with the plate here. So somewhere around about here. We'll chop it off and we can work with that, and then this part will all come off obviously because it's doing nothing, and then from here rearwards we'll have to re-weld it. That's what we're planning to do anyway. Might change obviously in progress, so let's see how we go and what we can get done. Okay, so I've put a cut line above this plug weld, and obviously I can see down the tube here, so I can see a little bit of what's going on, and you can feel when the grinder breaks through this tube, and I'm just being very careful not to nick the tube inside here. So I've just cut straight in above the plug weld, and then when I've got to here, because there's a few obstructions in the way which I will move in a little while, I've taken the angle grinder and I've cut up on an angle, and again I'm trying to avoid damaging this tube here, which will have to be welded and sanded if I nick it. So I'm trying to be careful and prevent, you know, rework later on. So I've just cut up on an angle, and the objective is cut up through the weld and cut through the plate. So I've done that on this side, and I've done similarly on the back side. So in theory I should be able to just grab this and rip it off. So now we're back down to the bare frame, and as I said, you can see that this tube is just one long run. Now I have made a couple of nicks here, so whether they blend out or not, or whether I'll have to just patch weld them, we'll find out later on. But here's what I'm talking about here. So this piece here is just a piece of weld now, so we're going to just re-weld this onto the tube and reinforce this bracket on both sides. So we'll just re-weld those back to the main tube, and I can clean up all these other pieces hanging off here. So do the same on the other side now. Okay, so I'm at the stage where I want to start cleaning up some of this mess. So I can't get an angle grinder in here, so I think I'm going to have to use a Dremel multi-tool and just try and shave off around here on both sides, on the inside and on the outside. So between sanding off the welds, so these are just basically, this is a piece of weld that's left here, there's not much metal there, so I can sand most of that. I've got to be very careful. If I sand a flat spot in the tube, it's very noticeable once it's painted, so I've got to be very careful with that and try and avoid nicking the tube or putting a flat spot in it. So let's just get into a bit of just tidying up work, and then we can work out where this hoop's got to go on the end here. Okay, so I've done a little bit of cleaning up. There's a bit more to do still, but I wanted to get this roughly in place and figure out where I need to chop it. So the customer's asked for 580 millimeters from that mark on the tank to there, so that's about right. So I've just temporarily clamped these on, and now I can just use a Sharpie and just mark both these tubes where they've got to go, where they've got to be cut, and chop those and then work out how we're going to fit them up to the frame rails. Okay, so just to guide myself with a straight cut, just use a piece of masking tape, wrap it around the tube, and then follow that line with the cut-off wheel and the angle grinder. So we'll go chop these now. Okay, so we've chopped the hoop to the right dimensions, so that's going to go on here. Normally what you do if you're joining two pieces of tube together is put a slug between the two tubes, and the slug's just a smaller diameter piece of tubing that you can hammer into one end and then fit the other piece over it and then weld around it, and it just strengthens the joint gives you some backing on the joint. It also means you could drill a couple of holes in the tube and then weld through the hole and catch the tube behind, which again is a plug weld, which is like what we saw back here on the original frame, which I've chopped off. Only problem is the hoop that was supplied by the vendor to my client. This is should measure it so we all know. This tube is inch. It's a bit over 25, so it's definitely inch tube. So they've used inch stock to form this tube, but this tube on the bike is 3/4 or 7/8. 7/8 22. So I've got a 3mm or 1/8 of an inch diameter difference between these tubes. So I found some tube in my rack here, which whatever diameter that is. I'll be able to hammer a piece of that into the frame tube, but it's a loose fit in the hoop. So I'm still going to use this approach. I'm just going to cut a short piece off, probably 50mm, put 25 in here and 25 in here. Now I can't put much more than 25 because the bend starts, so you can't get too much in here before you start to go around the bend. So we'll just do it anyway. It'll help to align the hoop when we're welding it on. And what's going to happen is this, and I vaguely recall having done this on an SR400 before, is the weld joint between the hoop and the frame will really form a bit of a fillet around here, and then we'll just have to blend it in with a sander later on. So if you've got an SR400, it's 7/8 frame tube. See if you can buy a 7/8 hoop. Don't buy inch.